this is chapter 3, and it's interaction of X-rays with matter. So what we're going to concentrate on this chapter is whenever you take an X-ray on a patient, what's exactly happening. We're going to review just basic KVP, mass, MA, and time. KVP is the penetrating power. The KVP actually stands for kilovoltage peak. MAS stands for milliampere seconds. So you have to really understand what's going on there. Remember, when you set your mass, you're setting the number of electrons that are boiled off the filament that will ultimately be sent over in the tube current to the anode, and then they will interact with the anode material, and that's how X-rays are created. So you have to, again, have a basic understanding of what's going on in that tube whenever you're taking an X-ray. Also, when you set the KVP, you set those electrons in motion. How fast the electrons are going to travel from the cathode to the anode is dependent on your KVP. Okay, again, KVP is the penetrating power, and mass controls the quantity. So remember, we talked about two Q words, quantity and quality. Quality is KVP controls the quality or the penetrating power, and mass controls the quantity or the numbers of ultimate X-rays that will be created. So you have to understand how, whenever you're taking an X-ray, or if you go on into radiation therapy or nuclear medicine, whatever you go through, how do the X-rays actually enter the patient, and what happens to the tissues as the X-ray is going through. So on this next slide, you can see where, if you remember, we talked about absorption and scatter, and that's what this slide right here is saying. So the amount of energy absorbed per unit mass is absorbed dose, and remember, the unit for that is the rad. So what you want to do is the amount of electromagnetic radiation transferred to the patient, you want to keep that as small as possible. That's why you have to have a really good understanding of your technical factors. So absorption, without absorption, and the differences in absorption properties of your body, and that's where differential absorption comes in, you wouldn't be able to produce X-rays. So when you, like for example, a chest, when the lungs are black, that means a lot of X-rays reached your IR. The heart shadow, the ribs, the clavicle, the sternum, the scapula, the humeri, the reason that they look on the whiter side is because there is more absorption of the beam going on. What you want to make sure is that you minimize the scatter. Your beam, how you produce it is you have a tungsten filament, you heat the filament to incandescence. Remember, the melting point for tungsten is about 3,370 degrees Celsius, so it's really hot. And the target is also made of a tungsten-rhenium alloy, and tungsten and rhenium are two different metals. You will also hear of a molybdenum disc that is in the target. So the reason that we pick tungsten or the tungsten-rhenium alloy is because it has a high melting point, and more importantly, it has a high atomic number. So when the electrons hit the target, or whenever they go over and hit that tungsten-rhenium alloy, they're going to interact with the tungsten, and actually interact with the atoms within the tungsten, and that's how you actually create your X-rays. So you need something that has a high atomic number. Filtration, you have basically two, well, we'll talk about three different kinds, but filtration is filtration. What filtration does is reduces the beam by 50%. It makes your beam harder. You're getting rid of the low energy, soft baby X-rays pretty much. So you have inherent filtration, which is built into the tube. So it's the leaded glass envelope and the insulating oil. And then you have added filtration, which is added comes from the manufacturer, or the radiation physicist can put additional filtration in the tube. And when you add inherent and added, you get total. So inherent is about 0.5 to 0.9 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. And that's an important point to remember, because when we talk about inherent filtration in the tube, and that's what's built in, I told you about a leaded glass envelope. So it's always, whenever you're talking about filtration, it's aluminum equivalent. And then the added is 2.0, and then your total is 2.5 to 2.9 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. And that's if you're operating above 70 kVp. If you're operating below 70 kVp, the total filtration is 1.5 millimeters of aluminum equivalent. Your primary beam is the beam that emerges from your tube window. Okay, and you can see in this picture to your right, remember we talked about electromagnetic radiation and how it's emitted in waves. And most of the time whenever you see a picture of an X-ray tube, this is how the X-rays are generated. And you can see that there's longer and shorter wavelengths that are contained within this primary beam. And remember, whenever you're looking at the wavelength, it's the distance between the peaks. Whenever you're setting kVp, again, I told you that it's kilovoltage peak, and later on in physics and later on in the semester we're going to talk a little bit more detail about kVp, but the kVp is going to fluctuate as the voltage goes across the tube. Remember, your and your target is angled. We call that a beveled edge, and some of the electrons that are boiled off the filament are going to have to travel farther. So you're going to get a fluctuation in the voltage that's going across the tube, and that's why not all of your X-rays have the same energy. Okay, this next slide, there's a whole bunch of numbers on here. If an electron is drawn across an electrical potential of 1 volt, it has acquired an energy of 1 electron volt. So 100 kVp means that electrons bombarding the target have a maximum energy of 100,000 electron volts, or 100 keV, kilo electron volts. Kilo means of 1,000. Attenuation, again, we talked about this. As the X-ray beam passes through the patient, it goes through the process of attenuation. Some of it can go directly to your image receptor. Some are going to interact with air and maybe lose some energy or go through the patient. Some will be absorbed, some will scatter off. Some of that scatter won't reach your IR, and some of it will. And then we're going to talk about Compton and coherent scattering. And what you have to do is have a good understanding of these different interactions with matter. On this next slide, it says is formed only when direct transmission X-ray photons reach your image receptor. And if we go back to the slide before, direct transmission, some primary photons will traverse the body without interacting, and that's direct transmission. So again, that's what you want your image to be, but it can't always be that way. On this slide, it talks about the air gap technique, or using a grid. The air gap technique is putting a OID, or object to image distance, between. So what you do is put your image receptor and then your body part, and there's usually a 4 to 10 inch gap. And what happens, you can use this instead of using a grid, because the scatter that would be absorbed by the grid is now scattered off in the air. Why don't we use the air gap technique? Because you have an OID, and then you have to compensate for that OID with increasing your SID, and whenever you do that, you're going to have to increase your technique. This slide here is primary, exit, and attenuated photons. Make sure that you have a really good understanding of your primary beam. That's what's emitted from the tube. Photons that are attenuated, photons that are absorbed. Okay, make sure that you know the difference between that, because attenuated is absorbed and scattered. Okay, so if an X-ray photon goes, and it's, let's say for bone example, because bone has a high atomic number and it's completely absorbed by the bone, obviously that's not going to reach your IR. It could be attenuated, where it interacts with the matter within your body and then it scatters off. Now sometimes that scattered photon will go off in a different direction and not reach your IR. Sometimes it will interact with the body part and lose some energy and go in the same direction to your IR. So this is a really good picture to study from whenever you're studying for the test. Alright, scatter on your IR has to do with fog. Fog is unwanted density tones on your image receptor. Alright, anytime you have unwanted density tones on your image receptor, what you're doing is covering up some of the anatomy that the radiologist needs in order to give a good diagnosis for the patient. So how do you control fog? You make sure that you're using the proper technique, make sure you have the correct distance, make sure you're shielding the patient, make sure that you are collimating, because collimating, you're going to reduce the volume and area of tissue exposed. Alright, if you look at these two images, they're both of a lumbar spine, but look at how much better B is. Alright, there's 5 lumbar vertebrae in each one of these, but because the collimation was out, because you can see air and feces in the colon, you can see a lot of soft tissue, where if you collimate, you're kind of zeroing in on the body part. And actually B is collimated too tightly because some of the anatomy is cut off, but I think you're getting the general idea here. Make sure that you look at Table 3.1, Appendix D in your book, because it's going to tell you about characteristics of the image, which results from numerous interactions, and then Table 3.2 in your textbook also. Alright, now, there's 5 different kinds of interactions, and you need to make sure that you know the general gist of each one of these. The thing about coherent scattering, we don't have that in X-ray, because the result of coherent scattering is just a small loss of energy. So another name for coherent is classical, elastic, or unmodified. This is very simple. It occurs with low energy photons. These are typically below 10 keV. The wavelength of both the incident and scattered waves are the same. So there's no energy has been absorbed by the atom. Rayleigh and Thomson scattering play essentially no role in radiography. So coherent scattering can be Rayleigh and Thomson. This is very low energy. It's below the technical factors that you will use for whenever you take an X-ray. Alright, so you can see what coherent scattering is here. And there's nice pictures in this PowerPoint. So the important thing with coherent scattering is the X-ray photon is very low energy. So the scattered photon possesses the same energy as the incident photon. Now remember, the incident photon is the one that's emitted from the tube. So every time we talk about the incident photon, it's the one that's actually going to interact with whatever, the body part, the air, the tissue, whatever. Alright, photoelectric. This is in your diagnostic radiology range, so 23 to 150 kVp. Now, very rarely do you use 150 kVp, and when you would be in the 20